your screen.
Got it.
Okay.
All right, here it goes. See if this works. Can you all see that?
Yeah, now you want to put it to full screen. You want it to put it on, you want to put it on beginning slideshow,
Okay.
the far side. Slideshow, yes, play, yeah.
In the beginning, there we go. Okay.
All right.
Does that look all right to you guys?
Looks great, thanks.
Awesome. So this is a presentation that I've been thinking about and wanting to put together now for, I don't know, at least a couple of years. I give presentations on a whole bunch of different tree related topics. And this is one which I think is going to quickly become probably my most important presentation. I've been kind of an anti-topping evangelist for years, and I think that the information about topping being bad for trees is like, it's small compared to the issues that we're facing today. So yeah, but this is a presentation that I'm still working on though, so bear with me, you guys. It doesn't have my usual polish to it, but anybody who's got feedback or questions, I'd love to get that stuff from you guys at the end. So I started making this up last night, trying to find information on historical weather data, and I couldn't find any sites that had really boiled it down the way that I wanted it to be. So I just went through the weather data my own self, and it took a couple of years, or a couple of years. It took a couple of hours, but I went as far back as 1980. And I think I'm going to go back a little bit farther for the next time I give this talk. But this is the number of days per year that it was over 100 degrees. So in 1980, there was only one day over 100. And now you can see 1981, that year at 14 days is definitely an outlier. But look at all the rest of the years between 1980 and I would say 2009. We go 2, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 3, 0, 6. Now 1992 is in red because that year we also set a new temperature record. And in 1996, let me grab my notes here. Here we go. Oh, I forgot to mark it. So in 1992, it was 105 degrees. That was the hottest it had ever been at the airport in Yakima as of 1992. Now in 96, we set a new record. That year it reached 110 degrees. And then you can see the other year in red is 2021, last summer, with 113. Now that's using the weather station data from the Yakima airport, but using just my own thermometer, I measured 122 degrees on one day last summer at 3 locations. Wow. So anyway, I think the airport might not be as hot as it gets for Yakima. So look at how the numbers, except for 1981, look at how the numbers stay low until we get to 2009. And all of a sudden we got a 6. And then in 2012, there's an 8. And then, let's see if I can move this around. Yeah. In 2013, we got a 9. In 14, it goes 11. In 15, it goes 22. So even though 2015 wasn't quite as hot as last summer, it was actually worse because we had 22 days where it was over 100 degrees. Now, if you take the average of all of this, and you can see what's happening, right? You can connect the dots on this curve, on this graph. You guys can figure out what's happening, and you don't have to be a scientist to do so. You know what I mean? This is really like a huge change since 1980. In 42 years, the climate in Yakima has gone from being over 100 degrees 1 or 2 days a year to being like that for a dozen or more. So this is a 6-fold increase in the average number of 100-degree days. So if you're a climate denier, just start being quiet about that and hop on board with the reality train, because these are the facts. Like, these are the number of days per year that it's been over 100 degrees. And within the last 42 years, the record has been set 3 times. So now, of the change that's taken place, most of this has taken place within the last 15 years. So what are the next 15 years going to be like if the rate of change continues to increase as rapidly as it is right now? The next 15 years should see as much change as the last 5. See what I mean? Look at, since 18 here, if we start taking average of those 5 years, of 2018, 2019, 2020, 21, and 22, if we take those kind of average of those last 5 years, that might be more like what we should expect out of the next few years. Maybe even a little bit worse. So the situation is grim. Now, we already live in one of the hottest and driest places on the world. Our average rainfall, our average precipitation, used to be 11 inches per year back when settlers first came to this area. In the late 90s, it was down to 7 inches per year, and now it's down to 4. Now, most of that rainfall comes in just 1 or 2 big storms. And if they just happen to miss your part of the world because of the way storms work around here, then your rainfall that year could be a ½ inch. So the situation is becoming untenable for certain species. And these are them. In the picture here, we've got a European birch, the Betula pendula. And unfortunately, there was this landscaping fad that was going on for the last 75 years, and everybody just loves those trees. They're one of the most commonly planted, one of the most popular species in Yakima. And I would say within 25 years, there won't be any more. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but in addition to the European birch, there is also Western red cedar that's just dying out right now. And that's a native species. Black walnut, another one that's going to be extinct in 25 years. We'll talk about the reasons why, but and then dogwood, I also wanted to put on my list, even though it's not nearly in as bad a shape as the others, but I just see so many really sad looking dogwoods that but these are in the course of my work, you know, like day to day, I might go to 2 or 3 houses a day in the Yakima area. sometimes as many as 8 or 9. And I see so many different yards and so many different trees, hundreds of species. You know, I have thousands of individuals under my care. And so these are the 4 species that you see problems with in every single individual. You probably cannot find a single one of these trees in Yakima that doesn't have some problems. So let's go into this a little bit, talk about each one of these in turn. The European birch here first. And I start with this one because in the world of trees, the Betula pendula is like tigers. You know how tigers are for like the endangered species movement? Well, birch trees are like that for tree huggers. People love birch trees so much and they just want them to live. They think they're so beautiful, and they are. But yeah, the problem here is that they're just not from an area that's like Yakima. They're from the south part of France, where, you know, it never really gets that hot in the summer and it never really gets that cold in the winter. And it's always just a pretty perfect, like 65 to 85 degrees. You know, like say Southern Oregon or Northern California or something. If you've ever seen one of these trees down there, oh man, they're amazing. So as a result of being in the place that gets a lot of extreme weather temperatures here, then every single one of these is really vulnerable to pathogens because they're all really stressed out and weak. So if you expose any population of any organism, probably, I bet it doesn't matter if it's pigeons or fish or worms or trees, you know, that if you expose them to a pathogen, some of them get it and some of them don't. And the reason for this is because some of them are stressed out and weak and they get it, and others are strong and healthy and so they don't get it. And so the problem here is that they're all stressed out and weak. So there's this pathogen called the bronze birch borer, which is taking advantage of the situation like any pathogen would. And you can see the damage that they do in the picture here. That hole is about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And around it, it's got a little bit of brown or bronze colored solution coming out of the hole. And so that's, you know, the stain goes away from the hole probably anywhere from 1 to 4 inches. So you've probably all seen this. I bet there's not a one of you that hasn't seen this yet, because it's happening all over town. You can't even drive to the grocery store without seeing this. So going back a picture here, it shows up like this, where it shows in the dead top first. The pathogen, the adult insect, lays its egg on the surface of the trunk, on the bark, and it covers its egg with a white, like spider web or cobweb material. And I think that's why they use birch trees, is because birch trees have white bark. So they're using the bark to camouflage their egg, because birds would otherwise eat those eggs. But when the egg hatches, the larva eats its way into the tree, and it gets into the cambium tissue, which is the vascular system of the plant, and that's just underneath the bark. And then the cambium is all full of carbohydrates and water and nutrients, and that's all that little larva needs to grow. So it eats its way around the tree, girdling the tree as it does, and interrupting the movement of water and nutrients past that point. So it results in the dead top of a tree, like you see in this picture here. Once a tree has lost about 50% of its foliage, like I would say this one has, they've only got 2, maybe 3 years left in them. So yeah, this one's been really a tough issue for me, because I don't know, I'm in this business to try to save trees, and I just, particularly last summer, had to watch hundreds and hundreds of my patients die. So there is, however, a pesticide that can be applied to the tree. It's injected into the ground in the springtime. But not only is it, does it not work, it's totally not effective, but it also has all kinds of negative side effects. And so first I'll explain why this pesticide doesn't work. You inject it into the ground in the springtime when the tree is building its first set of leaves. All those leaves are coming on at the same time. And so the tree sucks up this pesticide and gets tricked into thinking that the pesticide is phosphorus. And so it uses the pesticide to build its new tissue with its leaves and its flowers and later on its catkins. And anyway, this stuff turns out not to be phosphorus, though. It's like a Trojan horse virus. Anyway, that any insects that touch or consume those parts of the tree that have pesticide in them, they die. It's a broad spectrum pesticide that kills every single insect, which is the negative side effect. I'm sure you've all heard about the problems happening with honeybees. Well, this is why. So here in Yakima Valley, we've lost 99% of our honeybees. And not really many people understand what will happen if plant reproduction stops. But basically everything would die. All the birds, all the animals, all the insects, all the fish in the streams. I mean, the only thing that would still be alive would be like forms of algae and bacteria. But it would be gruesome if plant reproduction in Yakima County stopped. For example, it could if there were to be a recession. Because right now, the only way that plants can reproduce is because farmers bring in honeybees from out of state to pollinate their orchards every spring. And those honeybees are around for a long enough period of time that allows pretty much all the plants in the area to reproduce. And so if there were to be a recession and farmers were to decide that for whatever reasons that year they were just not going to harvest a crop, and since they're not going to harvest a crop, they might as well not incur any of the expenses like hiring workers or bringing in honeybees, then that year nothing reproduces. And this would mean the collapse of our entire ecosystem. So right now, these trees are being poisoned with pesticide, and it has no effect upon the bronze birch borer because the tree creates 3 sets of leaves per year, and only the first set is poisoned. So sets number 2 and 3 that come onto the tree later on throughout the whole season, the tree every day is losing a few leaves and growing a few back. And so by the end of the year, like about this time of year, the tree is on its 3rd set of leaves for every place where there is a leaf. And by then, even if you treated it in the springtime, by fall, the tree has no resistance left, no chemical pesticide in it, because it has replaced all of the tissue that used to have the pesticide in it. So at the end of the season, the tree is vulnerable to the bronze birch borer, and that's why every single Betula pendula gets the bronze birch borer, even if you use the broad spectrum insecticide. Since you can't kill the bronze birch borer, but you can kill all the honeybees. And so this is one of the worst situations. It's like, anyway, it has the potential to really escalate into a crisis, which is worse than what most people understand. But as a result of this is why I think in 25 years, you know, the climate will probably be a little hotter and warmer than it has been for the last 25 years. And if that happens, these things just won't make it. So if you got any of these, enjoy them. Take some pictures of them, hang your hammocks in them, and plant some replacements. We'll get into what to plant later. The Western red cedar. This is one that's disappearing right now, almost en masse throughout central and eastern Washington. Now, as many of you probably know, this is native to the western side of the mountains, or the wet side, and even over there, it prefers to grow in swamps. So how it can even live in Yakima, I don't even know. But maybe that day is done. Because what you see in this picture here is what's happening to them. They go from being totally healthy to being totally dead in a period of 2 to 3 weeks. Now, for tree death, that is amazingly fast. Normally, tree death takes place over the course of decades. For trees to die in the course of weeks is ridiculous. And we don't really know for sure why this is happening. I just did some research on this last night to check and see if scientists at UW or WSU, where the primary research programs about this phenomenon are taking place, to see if they had made any advancements yet. Then they have not. They have no idea. All they have done is ruled out pathogens. It is not being caused by any insects or by any bacteria or fungi or living organisms of any kind. That is not happening. The only thing which is statistically correlated with the deaths of these trees is hot, dry temperatures. And when you consider that these trees are not intended for hot, dry locations, then yeah, it makes sense, you know, that trees that had been just barely existing on the edges of their tolerable habitat are now finding themselves outside of those margins. So yeah, another one that it'll probably continue to exist over on the west side, or maybe in really wet and humid locations over here. But I would say for the most part, this is another one that's just going to go away, and we definitely shouldn't be planting more of them. Black walnut is one of those species, however, that's actually going to go extinct, at least on this continent. The disease which is killing it is called thousand canker disease. And this is one of the more high profile situations going on right now. This is another one of those wildly popular species that so many people have a great love for. It's a popular type of wood to use in by woodworkers for, you know, cabinets and, you know, high quality furniture and stuff. Yeah, if you think about the worst tree pandemics in living memory, like Dutch elm disease, that was killed 65 to 80% of infected individuals. This thousand canker kills 100% of Juglans nigra. There has not yet been a single recorded case of one tree that survived this disease. So yeah, they're saying like maybe as short as 15 years, but 25 at the outside. and there won't be any more. So if you got grandkids, if you got family, like take them out, show them some black walnuts, because they'll be the last ones to ever see them. This is how it looks in the tree. It's really easy to diagnose. You see a big dead tops in a black walnut. Boom, diagnosis complete. I have trouble even charging money for that one, because you know, like, it doesn't take much. But yeah, you could also shave off a slice of bark, and once you see those insect galleries, you know. But the way this disease works, it's actually a fungal disease which is carried on the body of an insect, which bores into the tree and eats its way around. So the insect doesn't kill the tree, but the fungal disease on the insect does. What are you going to do? I know. It's a tough situation. So now English walnuts are also at risk here, but this disease only has about a 40% mortality rate in them, which is still terrible that 4 out of 10 die. But it's not like the other 6 that lived through it were just fine afterwards. You know, they look a lot like the ones in the picture here. They look like they just been through the wars. They got a lot of dead tissue throughout them, and even though they're technically alive, you wouldn't say that they're really a super valuable shade tree anymore. So even though English walnuts, you know, more often than not survive, it's a devastating disease for them too. So we'll talk about what can be done to help them here in just a moment. This is another one that we've probably all seen, dogwoods. This is they usually have pink or white flowers. They're Cornus Florida, actually native to the southeast, like Kentucky and the Carolinas and places like that. And as you know, if you've ever been there or even just seen TV, man, is that place different from here. I mean, the guys in the military don't call this place Yakistan for nothing. I mean, this is where they send people in the military who are getting ready to go to Afghanistan because they have to get used to the climate first, you know? Anyway, so just like all these other trees that are struggling due to climate issues, so are dogwoods. And you wind up with a lot of drought damage, and drought damage tends to accumulate. So at the beginning of summer, you know, you're like, oh, it's not too bad. It's doing okay, you know, and then by the middle of summer, you're like, oh, gosh, that thing doesn't look so good. And by the end of the summer, everybody's like, oh my God, is it even gonna live? And the answer is yes, it'll live. It's a deciduous plant, so it's designed to lose all of its foliage every year anyway. The stems and the twigs, they're not dead. It's just the outer edges of the leaves that die. So drought damage is like in a deciduous tree, you know, next spring, it'll just all come back and probably be okay. Assuming it doesn't ever lose more than 50% of its foliage. That's a bullet point I should put on here. 50% foliage loss in any one of these situations I've described so far is a threshold that once you pass that, man, the tree loses the second half of its foliage a lot faster than it loses the first half. So, you know, when we're trying to triage these things, you know, usually I tell customers, like, look, if it's lost more than half of its foliage, recovery is probably not even possible. And, you know, especially in cases of like the black walnut or the European birch. But with these dogwoods, yeah, they maybe have a better chance than the birch or the black walnut from coming back from 50% foliage loss. But even so, it's not much better. It's a small notch, but not a great big improvement. So the main issues here are, how do we go about helping these plants that are struggling because of these climate change issues? And these are the things I've come up with. It's a pretty simple list, which I don't know, probably you guys could have come up with too, I bet. But it's the best I got. Mine is a very emerging science right now. We know very little about how plants work. Most of what we thought we knew has turned out to be wrong. And so we're just like in these big re-education programs in my industry over and over again. But what we have settled on now seems to be pretty unassailable. Nobody can argue with this. And the most important thing that you can do is compost application. Now, it's long been known that if you want to have a healthy garden or a healthy crop of whatever, then you put down compost. And so all I'm saying is, it turns out to be the same with all plants. I know, it's a good thing you guys are getting this for free, huh? So compost is what this person's holding in their hands in this picture here. It used to be plants, used to be mulch of some kind. Could have been bark chips. Maybe it was grass clippings or kitchen waste or leaves or whatever, but it got decomposed so well that now it looks mostly like dirt, and you can't really tell anymore that it used to be plants. Now, this ought not to have any animal manure in it. No steer manure, no chicken manure, and no fish guts. All that stuff is too hot and can cause fertilizer burn, whereas compost, you don't run that risk. So to help out trees, you got to put this down everywhere. And we used to think that the root systems of trees were mostly contained within their drip lines. And now we know that is so wrong as to be laughable. In truth, root systems of trees in the forest extend for miles. There's a study going on in the North Cascades, and last year that I looked at the data, which was, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now, they had been measuring this root system since 1948, when they dropped a water balloon out of an airplane that was filled up with a radioactive dye. And then every year they would overfly that same spot again and take a picture with a special camera that could see that radioactive dye through the earth. And so they would be able to tell the size of the plant's root systems that absorbed that dye. And since 1948, as of a few years ago, the root system, the largest root system which had been measured by then, was 62 miles long. So for the root system of a shade tree to cover your whole entire yard would be nothing. In fact, if you got neighbors, it probably goes into their yards too. And if they have neighbors, it probably goes into their yards, and so on, limited only by the streets. And of course, foundations of homes, it can't really grow into those either. So here in town anyway, most root systems tend to be block shaped. So if you want to put down compost to help your tree, you got to do it over as much of the root area as you can, which basically means your whole property. In grass, do it a ½ inch deep. In garden beds, go 1 inch deep. Now, the benefits of compost here are cumulative. You're doing a bunch of good with it. You're not only restoring nutrient deficiencies, because we have really crummy soil here, you know, we just went from ice 10,000 years ago to desert and grassland ever since. There's never been a forest growing here. And even if there was an orchard at one point where you live there, that doesn't matter for soil formation and geologic time. That just was an eye blink. So anyway, you're not only restoring nutrient deficiencies, which takes a little time. You know, the first time that you do it, you probably didn't put enough down in order to actually help plants. And you're also going to be inoculating the soil because there's a whole bunch of beneficial symbiotic microorganisms that grow in compost that help trees. And a really big, important one of those is tree roots. It just turns out that tree roots are not made out of trees. They're made out of fungus called mycorrhizae, and that grows in compost. So if you put down compost, you're putting down more tree roots. If you want to slow down the decline of your awesome birch tree and make it last as long as possible, it needs access to a bigger root system so it can get more water and more nutrients and minerals and exploit more soil volume. So, but you're colonizing the soil, right, with new living things. And the first time that you do it, well, I mean, to be honest, conditions are hostile and most of them just die. So it takes a few times to build up their populations to a level which is actually meaningful to plants. So between these two things, the restoring of nutrient deficiencies and the inoculation of soil, bottom line is it takes 5 times to really start to make a difference for your plants. The first time that you do it, the second and third times that you do it, you won't notice any above ground changes, or if you do, it's only because you're very observant and a very careful gardener. But most people just, they don't even notice those small changes. But once you hit 5 times for most locations throughout the valley, that's been my experience, that suddenly you'll look up and you'll see a big change. Your plants will be visibly healthier and more full and more lush with more foliage, doing more photosynthesis to make more sugar for themselves so that they can grow more and be healthier and stronger. So yeah, that's the biggest thing that you can do. Everything else on this list, if you added it all up, items number 2 through 5, they would not be as important as item number 1. But let's go through them anyway, because every little bit counts when you're trying to make, you know, a $50,000 tree last another 5 years. They can have a huge effect upon property value. Just to give you some idea here, I should make this a whole nother slide, but studies were done in Portland and Seattle to determine how much value different types of landscaping had. And the way they did the one for trees was they took 1,000 properties that were as similar as possible, that had no trees, and another 1,000 that were also as identical as possible, except that they had one mature shade tree somewhere on the property. Now, the average difference in value between those two groups, the test group and the control group, was 10%. The properties with a single tree were worth 10% more than the properties with no trees. Now, that was in 2007, 2008, just before the mortgage crisis happened. So since then, some people decided to see if that held true after the mortgage crisis, and they tested it in other cities. And now in the tests that were done in Phoenix and in Albuquerque, the average difference in value was 25%. So that one tree made those properties be worth 25% more than the properties without any trees. Now, why would trees be so much more valuable in a desert town? No duh, huh? So that's what we're dealing with here is like, when I say a $50,000 tree, yeah, that's like, you know, that's 25% of a $200,000 home. I mean, and most homes would still be worth more than that if you set them on fire. So, but I mean, anyway, let's go through these other things that you can do to help out a struggling tree. Irrigation. Man, most people's problem is that they irrigate very shallowly for less than an hour. They get the top 3 or 4 inches of soil wet, and that's it. Now, roots from any plant, whether it's tree or grass or whatever, can only grow where there is water. So all the roots of all the plants become very shallow when you irrigate for a short period of time. And that is the layer of soil that the sun can dry out really quickly and easily on a hot day. So to get deeper roots and more drought tolerant plants, because now they'll have roots in a region of the soil that the sun can't dry out, you got to irrigate more deeply. And that's why orchardists turn their sprinklers on 24 hours at a time. I know. Most people are sitting at home thinking that an hour was a long time. And I'm like, oh God, no. So I would say try to go during hours of darkness. That's one thing we could do a little better than what most farmers around here do. They irrigate for 24 hours, rain or shine, night or day, they don't care. But you would lose a lot less water to evaporation if you concentrated your irrigation during hours of darkness. If you could run your sprinklers for overnight, just turn them on when you go to bed and then turn them off when you get up in the morning, and that would be a good start, but you'd only need to do that once a week. Now, after you've developed a nice deep root system on your plants, that once a week watering is all you got to do. That's it. I think I got a good slide on this here. Yeah. So check out the root systems here. Let me move my window. I don't know if that's in your guys' way too, but so on the left, we've got the best root growth. That's with deep and infrequent watering, like 12 to 24-hour sets once a week. In the middle, they did test plots that did deep watering frequently, like every day. Well, in those ones, they developed very few roots because they were being drowned. In the other system, on the far right, with shallow watering, but very frequent, that's what most people do. You get most all of your root growth happening in that very shallow surface layer the sun can dry out. So once you've developed a deeper root system, then you can back off on your watering and only do it once a week. But for the first, I would say 2 or 3 years of deep irrigation, you still got to keep up with your frequent waterings to keep that surface layer from getting too dried out. Remember, that's where most of your roots are, if not all of them. If that root layer gets dried out and stays dry for a whole week, pretty much everything is going to die. So you got to irrigate deeply for 2-3 years before you can back off on your frequency and start to actually save some water. But in the end, yeah, you can actually save substantial amount of water. So that's deep irrigation. You're working towards a more orchardist model of doing it. Now with pruning, man, this is where everybody wants to go. We are above ground creatures, and as a result, we tend to think about solutions that focus on above ground activities. This is something I can do. I'm going to do it. The problem is that pruning, if it removes living tissue, if it removes anything that's green, is just making the problem worse, right? These trees have already lost too much of their photosynthesis. They're not making enough sugar to feed themselves anymore. We can't make that problem better through pruning. So when you prune a struggling tree, you got to restrict yourself to only dead tissue. And if you do that, you actually can do some good, because dead tissue takes up space inside the plant that living tissue could occupy if you cleared out the dead stuff. So this helps the tree to get thicker and fuller and denser. All right, number 4 is maintain the turf ring. The turf ring is a ring around the trunk with no grass in it. If you don't have one of these, your tree has a 10% chance of survival. If grass grows up against the trunk, there is a 90% chance of tree death from mower and string trimmer weed whacker injuries. 9 out of 10 trees with grass against the trunk die from repeated weed whacker injuries. So to prevent that, you don't get in there with scissors or anything like that. Instead, you just get rid of the grass. Just remove the grass from the surface of the soil, and you got to do this very carefully with your fingers and maybe a butter knife or something. But you do it kind of like, it's kind of gross, but if you were like taking the skin off of an animal, you work the knife around the edges and then peel, and then knife around the edge and peel a little more, and so on until you've got the circle of turf cut out. But you can't just stomp a shovel or something in through the grass to get it all, because of course then you'll cut tree roots too. So you're trying not to damage the tree roots when you make a turf ring. Now you got to replace the turf with mulch, and you want a good 4 to 6 inches of it. So if you were to be in Seattle and you were to hire a landscaping company or a grass lawn mowing company to come and mow your grass for you, and you wanted to get the lowest level of care that they provided, their bronze package or whatever they offer, and you asked them, over the phone beforehand, you'd say, what services do you provide for your least expensive service? They would say, we do mowing, we do the edging, we cut low dead branches out of your trees. And the reason why they do that one is because they don't like getting them poked in their face. And they will maintain turf rings. Now, why do they do this as part of their least expensive package? Because they know that if they don't do it, they'll kill all your trees. So if you're like a lawn mowing company, and remember how many dollars trees are worth. So if you're doing, lawn mowing and you accidentally damage the property value of a place, you make it go down by 10 to 25%. Oh my God. Yeah, in Seattle, it's so much money that lawn service companies stopped doing such terrible work a decade ago because property values there are really high. But here in Yakima, I don't know of a single lawn mowing company that offers this service. In other words, property values here are still so low that nobody has sued their lawn service company for killing all their trees, even though it happens all the time. It's happening on my street on Tuesday. I'm serious. That's the day the mower comes along and weed whacks the heck out of all the trees I just planted. And why? Because they don't maintain the turf rings. Okay, so next and last, number 5 is plant more trees. That's how you can help a struggling tree. And now this is counterintuitive, so I'll get a little bit more into this later on, because it's the opposite of what most of us have been taught. But to continue, so here's how we can improve drought tolerance of existing plants. And this is the case not just for trees, but also for grass, for any growing living plant. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be lichen. And you do these things to increase its drought tolerance. Deep irrigation deepens the root system, like I already explained. You want to keep bare soil covered. And you want to do this with a nice thick layer of mulch, 4 inches or more. The reason for the depth is to prevent weed growth. Most people think that it's the landscaping fabric that prevents weeds from growing, but they're wrong. As anybody knows who has ever ripped out landscaping fabric, weeds grow right through that stuff. It's a completely fraudulent product and it does not do what it says it does. What does do that job, what studies have actually proven does prevent weed growth, is 4 inches or more of mulch. But that's a lot. Most people only put down 1 or 2. We're talking more than twice as much as what most people do in their garden beds. But if you did that, not only would you prevent weeds from growing, but you would trap a lot of moisture in the soil. You would prevent the sun from being able to dry out the soil. One of the biggest things that we can do here in Yakima is to cover grass with shade. Grass is the most water intensive plant in our landscape. Grass uses more water than anything else. A lot of people think that it doesn't because it's so much smaller than trees. But grass will use somewhere around 20 or 25% as much water as a tree does. So if you take a tree, say the tree covers 500 square feet of grass, and you measure the number of gallons per day that that tree transpires into the air, and you take another 500 square feet of grass that's not covered by a tree, it'll emit 4 to 5 times as much water as the tree does. And why? Because trees can regulate their water loss and grass can't. Trees are smart, grass is stupid. That's why it goes this way. So trees have these little tiny holes in their foliage called stomata. And these are the holes that the water would evaporate out of during transpiration. Each hole has a little sphincter valve on it, and they can close down those holes when it gets over 90 degrees, which is what they do. So on a hot day, grass is losing more and more water. The hotter it gets, the more water it loses. Trees, on the other hand, the hotter it gets, the less water they lose. So even though they have way more biomass, and even though it seems like they should be using a lot more water, they're actually using a tiny fraction of the amount of water that grass uses when it's exposed to the sun. So what we like to do is cover the grass in shade. Now that's going to reduce the temperature, and so the grass isn't going to lose nearly as much water. And the trees' shade is cooling the grass. So if you look around in your own yards, you'll probably find that the shadiest places are where your grass is the greenest. And it's greener there because there's more moisture available. So anyway, shade grass with trees. And when I say the next item here, increase the density of the planting, what I mean is kind of the opposite of traditional forestry. The founding assumption of all forestry practices is that if we cut down some of these trees, the ones that remain will each get more water, they'll each get more space and light and resources out of the soil, and they'll each grow better as a result, right? Well, it turns out that was wrong. It actually is just the opposite. The plots of land that were thinned out, the trees that remain have less water available to them after thinning. And why is this? It's because of increased losses to evaporation. After thinning the grove, there's a lot more sunlight hitting the ground. So the reverse is true. Say we want to increase the amount of moisture in the soil. How can we do this? Not by cutting down plants, but by adding plants. So if you can make the density of your gardens and whatever is growing in your beds be a lot thicker and denser so that there's no more sunlight striking bare soil anywhere, you're going to lose a lot less water to evaporation. So give you some idea, if you got a golf course with no tree cover, they're going to be losing about 95% of every gallon of water that they spray onto that grass to evaporation. Now, if you cover that same area with trees, they'll only be losing about 20% of every gallon to evaporation. You can cut your water losses dramatically by covering the area with trees. Now, if you do this with a dense planting, oh my gosh, you can almost stop your water losses to evaporation. Okay, the only water which is lost is the stuff coming directly out of the foliage, and the sun is no longer able to take any water directly from the soil. It can only get it out of the plants through transpiration. So increasing the density of your plantings. And then the last one here is about planting more drought tolerant species, and that's kind of a no-brainer. We'll get into exactly which ones those are. So when it comes to shade trees, I tend to focus on them because that's the best kind of plant to put in the ground if you're wanting to, improve drought tolerance. Remember how shade makes more water become available? Well, bigger trees make more shade. They are therefore better at the job of protecting water in the ground. People think, oh no, a smaller tree would use less water, but it's not about how much water they use. It's about how much water they can protect. That's the factor which is the most important here. Not how much they use, how much they protect. And the biggest trees do the best job. So I tend to focus here on the biggest ones. And the locusts are at the top of the list. Honey locusts are one of my favorites. But black locust is a native species. That's kind of nice. But they have wicked thorns too, which, I don't know, I like to climb my trees, so. Elms are also particularly drought tolerant. Their skill at restricting water loss by closing down those little sphincter valves on their stomata, man, they're good at that. They're almost as good as locusts. And the American elm is a really neat one to plant here because this is one of the very few places in North America where Dutch elm disease cannot get. in the rest of the continent, American elm trees get to be like 10 to 20 years old, and then they die from Dutch elm disease. Here in Yakima, we've got a few specimens, like one in Franklin Park that's almost 100 years old. It's massive. It's got to be one of the biggest elm trees left in North America. And it's just because of the desert around us is like a moat that keeps those bad guys out. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, Siberian elm, man, that thing is a borderline, I would call it a semi-invasive, but it can survive without any irrigation. If your property goes up for sale, nobody waters it for 2 years until it finally does sell. It's a situation I see all the time. The honey locusts and the Siberian elms will be the only trees that survive. You want to plant drought tolerant species? I know sometimes they're not always the greatest, but it's better to have some trees than no trees. Now, oak trees are also really good. Not quite as great though. Their skill at restricting water loss is very good, but they do have a couple of small flaws. Well, small, I guess, is depending on the size of the branch that falls out of the tree as a result of these flaws. Yeah, this is called summer limb drop. Some trees are just too good at restricting their water loss, so they stop losing water at all. Now, water is still entering the tree because it flows into the tree through osmosis, but it's not leaving the tree anymore. So, man, talk about getting bloated. Oak trees actually do. They get bloated. They absorb water and absorb water and absorb water and absorb water until they pop. And that results in a big old branch falling out of the tree occasionally. Usually happens on a hot day when they're just refusing to let a single drop of water go. So yeah, summer limb drop sometimes causes oak trees to lose a few limbs. As a result, they're not quite as high on my list, but man, I would still give them a 9 out of 10 on the scale. You know, they're still making it on the list. Now, beech, beech. I've been thinking about moving them up, honest, to number 3 position and moving oaks down to number 4. The only reason why I prefer red oaks and pin oaks over beech is because they grow so much faster. Beeches are not quite as fast growing, but they still tick all the other boxes. They're still, like all of these trees, every single one of these is immune to our local pathogens. They don't get any sicknesses. All of these trees are fast growing. Some faster than others, but whatever. All of these trees are relatively strong hardwoods. All of these trees are, I think at least, relatively good looking. I know that's a aesthetic opinion, but I'm entitled to mine. And I'm talking, so you got to listen. But yeah, beech tree, they're really cool. Anyway, if you find a few of them around in the Barge Chestnut neighborhood, as I'm sure you will, like there's one on the corner of Stanley Boulevard and Chestnut Avenue. That's the T intersection at the northwest corner of Franklin Park. Oh, that thing is just unbelievable. Your jaw will be on the ground if you walk underneath that tree and happen to look up. So anyway, beech tree is also high on the list. Now, aspen trees I put on this list primarily because of their drought tolerance, but as far as resistance to the spread of decay, all these others are amazing, and this one's not quite as great. It's also not quite as big, but it is the single most successful tree species on the continent. Quaking aspen, Populus tremuloides, grows in a wider range of conditions than any other species, period. And that is saying something. It'll grow in the Brooks Range of Alaska. It'll grow at 10,000 feet at Camp Muir on Mount Rainier. It'll grow at sea level in Ecuador. It's crazy the range of conditions that that tree can grow in. So when you combine that with the fact that it's also a native species, ooh, that one gets high marks. Plus, they're just so beautiful to look at. The way that they dance in the wind, the tremuloides of their name is well named. So yeah, they're a beautiful, beautiful tree. And they're also going through this really cool change right now where since the end of the last ice age, there's only been males in North America. All the females died out during the ice age. Only 3 males survived. And so anyway, in 2008, some tree lovers introduced females to North America from Europe. And so the females are spreading throughout North America. In 10 years, they made it 1,000 miles west. So for all of us, we've never seen a female before. We've never even seen an aspen seed. None of us even know what they look like. All of the aspen trees in our world have reproduced clonally. They clone themselves off of their root systems. And yet they've become the single most successful tree in the hemisphere. So, man, to think that they could now begin to reproduce through seeds as well and become even more successful is like, ah, oh, geez, well, if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. All right. Now, one of the main things that I have found that has been necessary in order to grow more drought-tolerant plants and adapt to this new climate that we're in is honestly up here. It's not even in our yards, it's in our heads. We gotta jettison some of this garbage that we've been holding on to. And a big one of those myths is that trees are competitive against each other. They are not. That is why orchards are now planted like this. When I was a kid, growing up in Sela out here, orchard trees were planted 25 or 30 feet apart from each other. And the reason for that was because everybody always assumed, just like in forestry, that trees were competitive against each other and that every single tree hated every other single tree and would always try to kill its neighbor. And then if you planted them too close, they would like do battle or something and hurt each other. It was always kind of vague about how that was supposed to work. But anyway, it turns out not to be true. And the reason why orchardists now plant trees a few inches apart from each other is because they believe all the science that has come out, which proves that plants grow better when they're more densely packed. And just to give you that one example again of soil moisture availability, if there's more shade from more trees, there's more soil moisture. And so in this condition, like you see here on this screen, these trees have more soil moisture available than in the olden days when trees were planted 25 feet apart from each other. So yeah, density is good, not bad. It's taken me a while to implement that knowledge, to learn how to actually use it. Because I was taught, oh, you prune trees apart from each other, don't you? To keep them from touching. You plant trees far apart, don't you? Nah, not if you want healthy trees. not if you want drought tolerant trees. Item number 2, topping and thinning. I hope this is not a new thing to you, but just in case it is, topping and thinning are done in fruit trees for profit motive reasons. They top trees to keep the fruit within range of what ladders can reach. Now, they've even experimented with using taller ladders and letting fruit trees grow taller so that each one would produce more fruit and they would get greater yields per acre. Why did they go back to using 12-foot ladders? Because it became too dangerous. The amount of money that it cost for all of those injuries from people falling off of a 16-foot ladder instead of a 12-foot ladder made it be more profitable to do a 12-foot ladder instead of a 16-foot ladder. And so that's why fruit trees are topped. Now, if you let them get to be as tall as they would want to get to be by genetics, a lot of those would become 60 or 80 feet tall. But let's think here about why they can withstand this. Now, for 5,000 to 10,000 years, we've been doing these breeding programs where we bred 2 trees together. We picked one that made the biggest and the juiciest and the sweetest fruit, and we bred it with another one that made great big, juicy, sweet fruit. And we bred them together. Now, what we've been breeding for is sugar production. So domesticated species, like in the orchards, they might produce 1,000 times as much sugar as they really need to meet their dietary requirements. But if you did this to an undomesticated species that hasn't been through those breeding programs, like, I don't know, say a maple tree or something, and it might only make about 140% as much as it really needs, you know, then it can't afford to lose very much of its foliage, can it? Whereas a fruit tree, it makes 1,000 times what it needs, and it can afford to lose. It could survive topping and thinning. Now, thinning is only done to allow humans to get their bodies into the plant to do the picking. If the plant density were to become natural, normal, humans could not even get in there, and we could no longer pick the fruit. So we got to thin them and top them for fruit production reasons. But just because that's what we do to fruit trees does not mean that's what you're supposed to do to shade trees. Think about what the purpose of a shade tree is. It's to make shade. Which one makes more shade? A topped shade tree or one that has not been topped? I know, no duh, huh? Sometimes I feel like I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a kindergartner. Like, I'm just trying to implement the most basic of information, the most rudimentary of understandings. That's where my industry is at, though. So one of the things which has been, I have found to be the biggest and most important myth to just reject as a myth, as not true, is the fact that we know better. We simply don't. Whenever we prune a tree because we think we know better than it does about what shape it should be and where it should grow, we find out we were wrong. Trees have somewhere between 17 and 23 senses, compared to our 5 to 9, depending on who you talk to and how you describe these things. Trees are able to sense their environment much better than we can. Their sense of hearing is about 10,000 times greater. Their sense of smell is about 100,000 times greater than ours. They have senses that we completely lack, like the ability to sense pockets of nutrients through a solid medium like the soil. We don't even know how they do that. So anyway, the main reason for all of these senses is because it makes them much better able to react and adapt to their environment, to their situation. So they sensed their environment perfectly and they adapted to it perfectly. And then some silly human comes along and goes, you know what? I think you would be better if you were more like this. And we rearrange the whole situation. And then the tree dies back and declines a whole bunch usually as a result of what we did, because it turns out we did not fully understand the situation. We lacked most of the information about it. The best analogy I could give you is that, you know, it would be like a 3-year-old pushing buttons on a computer, trying to figure out what it does, how it works.
Sean, I just want to say that if you want to deal with people's questions, we're running short on time. So I just want you to know that.
This is my last slide.
Okay.
And I would love to take anybody's questions that has them right now.
Great. So people need to unmute themselves if they want to ask questions. I personally learned why Delma Tayer's garden is so great, because she packs so many plants into it and puts so much soil on it every year that it's fabulous. So now I understand why her plants are all so beautiful. Delma, do you have any questions? You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. I know you really wanted to hear Sean talk about plants. Can you see how to unmute yourself? Hit that little microphone with a red line through it. Whoops. Not yet. Well, you're still muted, Delma.
Well, I would love to do this presentation again in a few months or a year or so, after
Okay.
I've had a little bit more time to refine this and improve it, add some more slides to flesh out my lecture with some visuals.
Let's see if there's some more other questions. Delma, you're unmuted now. Can you ask one? Do you want to? There you are.
I'm amazed at how much my husband knew. He was a scientist, and how much he knew that I've had revealed here. And all the things that I've fallen off from that I should be doing, like mulching.
Great. You do mulch though. You bring in mulch every year, don't you?
Yeah, do I what?
You bring in mulch every year, as I've seen you mulch.
Well, I've been a little careless about that. That's one that really bothers me, because he mulched every year.
Okay, do we have some other questions? You're right. Those are good things.
Yeah, I wondered where the maple trees fit in all this.
Maples are, I would give them maybe a 7.5 out of 10 in their ability to live in Yakima through this climate shift we're happening. Norway maples are being the hardest hit of all the maples. The Crimson Kings seem to be doing a little better. Japanese maples are doing okay, as long as they got some shade and protection from the wind. But yeah, the big Norway maple shade trees that went through another fad probably 75 to 30 years ago, they've lost their popularity in recent decades, but those ones are kind of becoming atypical. They're getting hollow interiors and an ever thinning shell of foliage around the margins. So those ones I worry about, but I haven't seen as many of those die yet as I have of all these other species I mentioned. So
Sean, should we be doing the same for maples in terms of the watering, the mulching, the things that you talked about earlier?
yeah, for any plants, whether it's a tree, a bush, roses, grass, it doesn't matter. If you want to make them become more drought tolerant, then do those things: the compost application, the deep watering, prune out dead foliage, mulch the soil, maintain a turf ring. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
John, what should we buy for mulch?
Well, I'm kind of partial to the free stuff that most tree services give away. But I think the bark mulch also looks pretty sharp. It tends to be a little darker color. Whatever you get though, just make sure that it does not have any dyes in it.
Yeah,
Dyed mulch is a completely unregulated market, and studies of dyed mulches have shown that about 60% of them, the dyes come from some industrial waste
oh,
and are actually toxic.
Oh my gosh.
So dyed mulches more often than not kill the plants that they're put around.
okay.
Could they be used on paths?
Dyed mulches?
Yeah, if they kill, if they're
As long
toxic.
as there was
they're weeds.
nothing on either side of the path that you wanted to live.
Okay,
Now, if there were things that you wanted to live and all you wanted to do was prevent weeds from growing,
uh-huh,
then 4 inches or more of mulch will do the trick.
okay. But dyed
What about
mulch would-
compost? Where do you get that? I don't have a compost bin.
In small quantities, you can get it in bags from just about any, big box farm and garden store. I like to support that little farm and garden store down on Washington and Long Fiber.
Yeah, I've gone there too.
Even late into the season, I've been able to buy compost there.
Okay.
But, I know Fred Meyer is out right now. So is Bimart.
Mm,
But anyway, in bags, you can get it at lots of different places. But if you want to get it in large volumes, like by the cubic yard,
uh-huh.
then the best resource that I have found is a company out of Sunnyside called Natural Selections Farms. And they actually do deliveries in a dump truck.
Oh, okay.
I
Great.
had a question. We have some birch trees that a landscaping service had recommended annual boring. They bore into the tree to put some insecticides, I think. Is that necessary, good, bad? It just seemed like it couldn't be good for the tree.
Yeah, that's definitely not an effective treatment. So these things are put into the tree in order to kill bronze birch borer and aphids, usually the 2 targets on birches. And they do kill those things, but because of how the trees replace their tissue throughout the season, they also are still not effective. So the companies that spray those products or that do the injections, they have scientific studies they can point to that show like, yep, we sprayed this product on a bunch of whatever, and they all died. So it kills that insect. Well, that's true, but in actual real life, because of the trees constantly are replacing their foliage, then the pesticide has a declining effectiveness throughout the growing season until by this time of year, there isn't any at all.
Mhm.
So it's and then you are, however, doing some harm, in terms of killing pollinators and other beneficial insects too. It turns out that about 2% of insects are pathogenic. So when we put out a broad spectrum pesticide, like imidacloprid, is this most common one they do injections with, that kills 100% of everything. So the problem is that the human is our incomplete understanding. We just went, oh, bugs. Yeah, let's kill them all. That's a good idea. And we did not know that 98% of them were either benign, where they just neutral, had no effect, or symbiotic, had positive beneficial effects. So when we kill off 100% of the insects, we're doing way more harm than we are doing good. Because how much good are we doing? Zero. How much harm are we doing? Lots. So yeah, to me, it's like, that's why certified arborists don't recommend those products, because we've seen the studies that show that, yes, even though they kill the insect, they're still not effective treatments. So it would be unethical to prescribe something which you know doesn't work. Now, the companies that do prescribe those treatments, do they know they're not effective? Oh yeah, they know. Why don't they care? Because they're unethical.
All right. Oh,
The
that's good.
problem is that they're not certified arborists, and so they have no credentials to be revoked. They're just some guy with a spray machine. And he's like, hey, I know all about trees. Trust me.
Is there more natural lawn care services available here in Yakima?
Colonial has a pretty good organic program. Yeah. They'll fertilize your grass with compost instead of chemical fertilizer. And they do not apply broadleaf herbicides to kill things like clover and dandelions, which, by the way, are not even weeds. Yeah, silliness.
Right.
But those broadleaf herbicides are also products which, do a lot more harm than good. Many species of trees reproduce through root shoots. Aspen are most famous for that, but cherry trees do it, elm trees do it, lots of maples do it. And so if you mow those up in your grass, you of course will have several hundred maple trees growing in your yard if you've got a maple tree somewhere, anywhere. It doesn't matter if your neighbor's got one. Of course, you'll not even know about them. You'll just be mowing them down. And then apply the broadleaf herbicide, and then watch as whole tops and branches out of your maple tree or your neighbor's maple tree die. And then you'll wonder, like, oh God, why did that happen? All I did was kill everything that wasn't grass, because that's what broadleaf herbicides do. Now, the targets to kill with those herbicides are usually clover and dandelions, which are hugely beneficial plants. So not only do clover and dandelion cause zero harm, but they do a whole bunch of really big benefits. So clover is a nitrogen fixator. It's one of the very few plants that gets its resources out of the air instead of out of the soil. So it fertilizes the ground where it grows. So if you've got clover in your grass, just run this test. I bet you $100 that wherever the clover grows, your grass is greener. And where the clover doesn't grow, that's your brown spots.
Okay.
I mean, I've never lost a bet on this ever once. Anybody wants to take me up on this bet, raise your hands and we're down. So clover is a nitrogen fixator, so it greens up all the plants around it. If you want a healthy vegetable garden, plant clover in the rows between your vegetables. Why? Because A, it fertilizes the soil where it grows, and B, it prevents weeds from growing there that would suck their nutrients out of the soil instead of out of the air.
So if you have a huge hill of dirt, steep hill, is clover a good choice to
It's a
one?
great ground cover. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the best ground covers that you can pick. It also makes a really pretty white wildflower.
Mhm.
Now, what I found is that changing the word from weed to wildflower is all that's needed. And boy, is that cheaper. And boy, is that better for the environment. But both of these wildflowers, the clover and dandelions are tremendously important sources of food for honeybees. And if we're ever going to get honeybee populations to climb back out of the tank, then we gotta plant things and stop killing things that are their food source. But yeah, it's all connected, you know?
And
Okay,
it's-
so our last question before we wrap up. And by the way, Sean, we were going to take you up. I'm trying to be sure people who need to leave can, but we probably are going to take you up on a return visit because let's give Sean a thank you for this. This has been fantastic, really helpful. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. But is there any last question here that we need? I don't want to cut somebody off.
I have one if nobody else.
Okay, go for
It's
it.
a good time to plant clover. Spring.
You can plant clover just about any time during the growing season. So I would say that starts in April and ends in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, I order clover seeds online. The white Dutch clover is the best kind.
Awesome.
Thank you. All
Yep.
right. Well, this has been very informative, very helpful, and we really appreciate it. We know how busy your day has been, Sean, and thank you so much for
Well,
doing.
thanks for your patience and waiting for me, you guys. I appreciate that.
No problem. Okay, well, let's thank Sean once again and sign off for the evening. And thanks everybody for coming. We watch your email for upcoming events, and thanks again. Take care.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Sean.
Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Delma. Bye, Sean. I'm gonna.
Yeah, find it.
Okay. Here we